You spend a lifetime building something. A business, a fortune, a name. You tell yourself you're doing it for them, for your family, the legacy. You work until your bones ache and your mind is frayed, all for the dream of handing it over to the next generation, secure in the knowledge that you've provided, that you've cemented your line. It's a beautiful lie, one I told myself for 60 years. My name is Elias Rice. I built Rice Consolidated from a two-man operation fixing tractors in a dusty barn into the largest agricultural machinery supplier in 3 states. I did it with sweat, with grit, and with a mind for numbers that borders on the obsessive. I thought my children and their children saw that. I thought they respected the hustle, the sacrifice. I was a fool, an old, sentimental fool. The cancer diagnosis 6 months ago was the final, cruel joke. Not terminal, the doctors said. Treatable. But it was the catalyst. It was the thing that made them stop hiding their true faces. Suddenly, my sprawling, quiet house on the hill was Grand Central Station. My son, Robert, and his wife, Cynthia, started visiting weekly instead of quarterly. Their conversations are clumsy, transparent dance around my will, the company shares, the property deeds. My daughter, Helen, was subtler, but her eyes, always so calculating, would sweep over my antiques, my art, mentally appraising, cataloguing. Her husband, that feckless parasite Mark, would just nod along, a sycophantic ghost. And the grandchildren, God, the grandchildren, Sarah, Robert's girl, a vulture in designer clothing, would simper and talk about her passion for interior design, and how this old place had such wonderful potential. Thomas, Helen's boy, a sullen tech bro who'd never gotten his hands dirty a day in his life, would drone on about liquidating non-performing assets and optimizing the portfolio. They weren't seeing a grandfather, they were seeing an ATM whose screen was flashing a low balance warning. The turning point, the moment the plan crystallized in my mind with cold, brutal clarity, was a Tuesday. Robert was driving me back from a chemo session. I was frail, pale, wrapped in a blanket in the passenger seat of his obscenely large car. I was feeling vulnerable, a sensation I despise. I made the mistake of showing it. The treatment, it's rough, son, it mumbled, staring out at the leafless trees, makes you think about what you're leaving behind. He didn't miss a beat. He didn't reach over and squeeze my hand. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He just said, "Of course, Dad. We've all been thinking about that. It's important to have things in order." Cynthia was just saying we need to sit down with Mr. Henderson and go over the trust structures again. Make sure everything is efficient. For the transition, not my death, the transition. Like I was a CEO retiring, not a father dying. In that moment, looking at his profile, at the faint, avaricious gleam in his eye he couldn't quite hide, something in me broke. Or perhaps something that had been broken for decades finally snapped back into its rightful, hardened place. The sentimentality, the hope, the foolish old man's desire for a loving family, it evaporated like morning mist. They didn't want a father. They wanted an inheritance. Fine. I would give them a performance. The performance of a lifetime. The next day, I called the only person on this earth I still trusted implicitly, Arthur Henderson, not just my lawyer, my oldest friend. We'd fox hunted and gotten drunk together in our wayward youth. Had been with me since the barn. I went to his house, not his office, and I laid it out for him in his wood-paneled study, the smell of old books and good bourbon in the air. He listened, his face a mask of professional calm, but I saw the shock in his eyes. Then, slowly, a grim, understanding smile spread across his weathered face. "Elias," had said, pouring to fingers of Macallan, "it's monstrous, it's cruel, it's absolutely something you would do. What do you need?" The plan was intricate, beautiful in its malice. The cancer was my cover. We would accelerate the narrative. I stopped having the cleaners come to the house. I let the place get dusty, neglected. I began to cancel social engagements, citing fatigue. I let my voice become a little weaker on the phone. I was laying the groundwork. The final act required a protagonist. We found him in a retired coroner from 2 counties over, a man named Dr. Evans, who was enjoying a comfortable early retirement funded by a sudden, anonymous consultancy fee from a blind trust Arthur set up. Evans had seen enough death to mimic its appearance perfectly. The night of my passing was a masterpiece of stagecraft. It'd taken a turn for the worse. Robert and Helen were summoned. They came, their faces a perfect pantomime of concern over a thrilling undercurrent of anticipation. Dr. Evans was there, solemn and professional, with his black bag. Head shooed them out of the bedroom, giving his final examination. I was propped up in bed, made up to look cadaverously pale. A mixture of drugs Evans had provided perfectly safe, but wonderfully effective slowed my heart rate to a faint, shallow flutter. My breathing was barely perceptible. Cold towels lowered my skin temperature. I was the picture of a man on the very precipice. They were allowed in one at a time for a final goodbyes. Robert stood over me, his hand on my cold arm. "It's okay, Dad," he whispered, and I could hear the excitement strangling his grief. "You can let go. We'll take care of everything." Everything meaning the money. Helen wept elegant, practiced tears. "Oh, Papa," Shed said. She hadn't called me that since she was 6. It was nauseating. Then Evans performed his magic. With the family gathered just outside the door, he used a clever little device that simulated a flatlining heart monitor. A long, piercing beep echoed through the silent house. He called the time of death in a low, respectful murmur. The wails that came from the hallway were not of grief, but of release. The waiting was over. The payday had arrived. The next part was the hardest, playing a corpse while being handled. The local funeral director, a sincere and kind man named Mr. Albright, was another unwitting actor in my play. Evans had signed the death certificate. My body was taken to Albright's funeral home. What no one knew was that the private preparation room had a hidden panel leading to a small, adjacent storage room. Arthur had ensured my remains were to be prepared by a specific, well-paid embalmer, a cousin of his, who understood discretion. I was walked, very much alive, through that panel into the storage room the moment the coast was clear. The casket contained a weighted, realistic dummy, a movie prop Arthur had sourced from a special effects company in California. It was good enough to feel real through a layer of satin if someone touched it. The lid was to be closed at the funeral at my specific prior request, a clause Arthur inserted into a document everyone was too busy to read closely. For 3 days, I lived in that storage room. It had a cot, a hot plate, a small fridge, and a laptop. Most importantly, it had a live audio and video feed from the main viewing parlor and later, from the chapel. I watched it all. I watched them parade past my closed casket, their faces a gallery of hypocrisy. Robert, already standing a little taller, accepting condolences with the gravitas of a new patriarch. Cynthia, dressed in a black Valentino dress that probably cost more than most of the cars in the funeral home parking lot, dabbing at dry eyes. Helen, the picture of bereaved elegance, holding court, sighing about how Papa fought so bravely. Thomas and Sarah, looking bored, scrolling on their phones, occasionally remembering to look sad. Their friends and business associates offered sincere sympathy, but my family, their grief was a thin veneer. I saw the glances they exchanged, the quick, suppressed smiles, the whispered conversations in corners that weren't about memories of me, but about the reading of the will. I heard it all through my headphones, the sound crisp and clear. "Do you think Henderson will do it tomorrow, or wait until next week?" Robert whispered to Helen by the coffee urn. He said he'd call us all tomorrow at 10. "God, I hope it's not messy. You know how Papa was with his paperwork. It'll be fine. We're the only heirs. It's straightforward. 60% to you and me. Split down the middle, 20 to be divided among the grandchildren." That's what he always said. He said a lot of things. Robert, I just want it in writing. I can't stand this house another day. It's so him. So oppressive. Oppressive. The house I built for my bride. The house where she raised our children. Where she died too young. Oppressive. The day of the funeral was a brilliantly sunny, cold day. Perfect weather for burying a man. From my little spy hole, camouflaged as a vent high on the chapel wall, I had a perfect view of the proceedings. The pews were full. The minister, who'd never met me, spoke generically about a pillar of the community and the devoted family man. I almost laughed. They all took their turns at the pulpit, lying through their teeth. Robert spoke of my strength and guidance. Helen talked about my generous heart. Sarah read a poem. Thomas mumbled something about innovation and vision. It was a farce, a beautifully orchestrated, utterly hollow farce. The moment they lowered the casket with its dummy occupant into the ground was the moment they truly believed I was gone. I saw their shoulders relax. I saw the mask slip completely as they turned away from the grave. Cynthia actually laughed at something someone said, before catching herself and putting a hand over her mouth. Robert was already on his phone, no doubt to his broker. They didn't go home to mourn. They went to the country club for a luncheon that turned into a celebration. I watched the video feed Arthur's Pie sent me. They toasted with my best scotch, smuggled out of my house. They laughed. They made plans. That hideous portrait in the library has to go, Helen declared. I'm turning the study into a yoga studio, Sarah announced. Thomas and Mark were discussing which sports car was a better investment. I watched it all, my heart hardening from flesh to stone, then from stone to diamond. Any last, lingering shred of doubt was annihilated. They weren't just ungrateful, they were ghouls. The next morning was the main event, the reading of the will. They gathered in Arthur's opulent conference room, around his massive mahogany table. I watched them on the live feed from a camera hidden in a smoke detector. They were buzzing. Robert was practically vibrating. Cynthia kept smoothing her dress. Helen had a legal pad and a pen, ready to take notes. Thomas and Sarah looked bored, but alert, like sharks waiting for chum. I took a final look in the mirror in my hidden room. I'd spent the morning getting ready. A sharp, dark suit, my best tie. My face was still a bit pale from the drugs and confinement, but my eyes were alive with a fire that hadn't been there in years. I looked every inch the formidable Elias Rice they thought they'd buried. I practiced my expression. Not anger, not rage. Cold, utter, disappointed contempt. Arthur had already begun. I could hear his voice, sonorous and slow, through the speaker. He was drawing it out, savoring it. And to my granddaughter, Sarah Elizabeth Rice, I bequeathed the sum of $250,000 and the collection of porcelain figurines in the drawing room cabinet. I saw Sarah's face fall. The figurines were worthless. She'd been expecting the house, or at least a significant chunk of stock. Thomas was next to my grandson, Thomas Michael Evans. I bequeathed the sum of $250,000 and my gold pocket watch. He scowled. A pocket watch. Head wanted liquid assets, cash to pour into his failing startup. I could feel the confusion spreading around the table. This wasn't the grand division they were expecting. These were token gifts, nuisance payouts. Then Arthur got to the meat of it. The old will. The one they were counting on. The remainder of my estate, including all shares in Rice Consolidated, all real property, including the primary residence and the lake house, all investments, and all remaining liquid assets, to be divided equally between my two children, Robert James Rice and Helen Rice Evans. There was a collective, audible sigh of relief. Robert leaned back in his chair, a triumphant smile breaking across his face. Helen reached over and squeezed his hand, a gesture of pure, avaricious solidarity. However, Arthur said, his voice dropping a register. The room went silent again. There is a codicil, a condition, a condition, Robert asked, his smile faltering. What condition? Arthur adjusted his glasses. The document states that this division is null and void if any beneficiary is found to have, and I quote from your father's handwritten addendum, displayed gross avarice, disrespect, or avaricious anticipation regarding my demise prior to the legal reading of this document. Arthur looked up at them, his face unreadable. The will further stipulates that the determination of such behavior is to be made solely by me, as executor, based on my own observations. The silence in the room was absolute for 3 full seconds. Then it exploded. What the hell does that mean? Robert barked, standing up. Avaricious anticipation. Helen shrieked. That's subjective. That's nonsense. He can't do that. Cynthia joined in. It's not legal. You saw us. Robert yelled at Arthur, pointing a finger. We were devastated. We were grieving. Everyone saw it. Arthur remained calm. My role as executor is to interpret the wishes of the deceased as written. My observation is that, in the days leading up to Mr. Rice's passing, and indeed at the funeral itself, there were multiple displays of what could be construed as this was my cue. The argument was reaching a fever pitch. Robert was red-faced, sputtering. Helen was weeping with fury. It was a beautiful cacophony of greed denied. I stepped out of the small antechamber that connected to Arthur's private entrance. The door was behind his chair. None of them saw me at first. I stood there for a moment, listening to the symphony of their rage. Then I spoke. My voice, strong and clear and unmistakably mine, cut through the noise like a scalpel. I believe what Arthur is trying to say, I said, is that you're all a pack of greedy, disappointing hyenas. The effect was cinematic. It was everything I had dreamed it would be and more. Robert, who was halfway out of his chair, gesticulating wildly, froze. His arms stopped in mid-air. His jaw went slack. The color drained from his face so completely I thought he might actually faint. Helen's furious tears ceased instantly. Her head snapped toward me. Her eyes, wide with shock and a dawning, impossible horror, locked onto mine. She made a small, choke sound, like a mouse being stepped on. Cynthia let out a short, sharp scream and recoiled, clutching her chest as if he'd shot her. Mark, for the first time, looked genuinely interested in something other than the bottom of a glass. His mouth was hanging open. Sarah stared, her face a perfect mask of utter incomprehension. Thomas actually dropped his phone. It clattered on the polished table, the screen cracking, but he didn't even notice. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of the absolute annihilation of reality. Ghosts don't walk into wood-paneled conference rooms. Dead men don't wear their best suits and critique the behavior of their mourning children. I took a few steps forward, enjoying the way the Persian rug muffled my footsteps. I came to stand beside Arthur, who allowed himself a small, tight smile as he looked down at his papers. I placed my hands on the back of his chair and leaned forward, sweeping my gaze across each of their petrified, ashen faces. "Cat got your tongues?" I asked, my voice deceptively mild. "You all had so much to say a moment ago." Robert, Helen, nothing to add. No comments on the oppressiveness of my house. No plans to liquidate my non-performing assets. The use of their own words they thought were spoken in private, broke the spell. It was the final, undeniable proof that this was real, that I had been there, listening, watching. Robert found his voice first. It was a strangled, incoherent whisper. "D-Dad, how? You're dead." I finished for him. "So we've been told. The paperwork seems to be in order. Dr. Evans was very convincing. Mr. Albright was very respectful. You all gave lovely, touching eulogies, especially the part, Thomas, about my vision. I found that particularly moving, given that you were checking your stock portfolio on your phone while you said it." Thomas flinched as if it struck him. "This is a trick," Helen suddenly shrieked, finding her voice in hysteria. "This is some kind of sick joke. A look-alike. Arthur, what is this?" "It's no joke, Helen," I said, my voice dropping all pretense of mildness. It became the voice I used in the boardroom to fire incompetent managers. It became ice. The joke was the performance you all put on for the past week. The grieving children, the heartbroken grandchildren. It was a farce, a pathetic, transparent farce, and I watched every second of it. I pushed off from Arthur's chair and began to slowly walk around the table, circling them like a shark. They recoiled from me as I passed, as if I were radiating a deadly cold. "I watched you, Robert, at the funeral home, asking the director if the casket was the premium mahogany because Dad would have wanted the best. He would have wanted a pine box, you idiot. He was a practical man. You wanted the best because you were standing in front of your business associates and you thought it reflected well on you. Robert looked down at the table, unable to meet my eyes. I watched you, Helen, critiquing the flower arrangements, complaining they weren't aesthetically cohesive enough for your taste. Your father was in a box, and you were worried about the goddamn peonies. Tears of sheer terror now streamed down her face. I have listened to you all, I continued, my voice rising, filling the room. For months, every avaricious hint, every avaricious question about the will, every avaricious plan for my money. You didn't see a sick old man. You saw a walking, talking lottery ticket. And the moment you thought it had been cashed, you celebrated. I completed my circle and returned to my place beside Arthur. I looked at each of them in turn, imprinting their shame, their fear, their utter defeat onto my memory. I would savor this moment for the rest of my very real, very continued life. So, I said, letting the word hang in the air, regarding the will. Arthur read you the old one, the one that left my life's work to the two people I thought would cherish it, the people I thought I raised. I paused, letting the weight of their lost fortune crush them. This, I said. And Arthur smoothly slid a single, crisp piece of paper from a fresh folder on the desk in front of him, is the new one. Executed and notarized this very morning. Quite legal, quite binding. The air in the room was sucked out. They were staring at that piece of paper as if it were a venomous snake. It's very simple, I said. It leaves every single asset of the Elias Rice estate, every stock, every bond, every property, every last dime, to a newly formed charitable trust, the Lazarus Trust, I'm calling it. Rather fitting, don't you think? It will fund agricultural scholarships for kids who actually want to work with their hands, and medical research for the kind of cancer I don't actually have. The sounds that came out of them then were not human. It was a collective groan of pure, undiluted agony. It was the sound of a dream dying. You, Robert gasped, his face purple with rage and shock. You can't. Well, fight this. Well, contest it. You're not in your right mind. This is coercion. This is knee. I interrupted, my voice quiet, but absolute, disinheriting you all. You get nothing. Not the figurines, not the pocket watch, not a single penny. You are cut off. From the money, from the company, from me. I looked at my children, at the empty, grasping strangers they had become. You spent so long waiting for me to die, I said. The final, crushing blow. Now you get to live with the consequence. You have to live with the knowledge that you had a father who would have given you everything, and your own greed is the reason you ended up with nothing. Now, get out of my lawyer's office. I turned my back on them. I heard one of the women, Cynthia, I think, start to wail. I heard a chair scrape back. I heard Robert's ragged, furious breathing, but I didn't turn around. I had seen all I needed to see. The revenge was not in the money. I didn't need it. The revenge was in the lesson. A lesson written not in ink on a legal document, but in fire on their souls. They had wanted my death. Instead, I had given them a ghost that would haunt them for the rest of their miserable, ordinary lives. And for the first time since my beloved Clara passed, I felt truly, completely alive. The silence that followed my command was thicker and heavier than any I had ever manufactured in my boardroom. It was the sound of a worldview shattering, of a future evaporating into thin air. I kept my back turned, listening to the wreckage of their expectations. I didn't need to see their faces. I could feel the seismic waves of their shock and fury radiating through the expensive air of Arthur's conference room. The first sound was a choked, wet sob from Helen. It wasn't a performance this time. It was the raw, ugly sound of a soul being gutted. Then came the scrape of Robert's chair as he shoved back from the table, the legs screaming against the polished floor. This is not happening, he whispered, his voice a broken thing. This is a nightmare. You monstrous, choose your next word very carefully, Robert, I said. My voice low, still not turning around. I heard him falter, the insult dying in his throat. The power dynamic had been utterly, irrevocably flipped. I was no longer the dying old man. I was once again Elias Rice, and he was a chastised child. You faked your death, Cynthia shrieked, finding her voice in a register of pure hysteria. You lied to us. You let us mourn you. That's sick. It's illegal. Finally, I turned. The sight was more satisfying than I had ever imagined. Robert was pale, swaying on his feet, his hands braced on the table as if it were the only thing holding him up. Cynthia was pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at me, her face contorted into a mask of outrage. Helen had collapsed forward onto the table, her shoulders shaking with genuine, despairing tears. Mark was patting her back uselessly, his face a perfect picture of bewildered incompetence. Sarah and Thomas just looked young and stupid, their mouths agape, their entire worldview one, where they were perpetually on the verge of a massive payday obliterated. Illegal, I repeated, letting a cold smile touch my lips. Arthur, my friend and lawyer, cleared his throat, the sound like a gunshot in the tense room. Mrs. Rice, the statutes regarding faking one's death generally apply to fraud for financial gain, such as collecting insurance payouts or evading debts. As Elias has, in fact, relinquished all claim to his estate, and as no insurance claims were filed, a stipulation I personally insured was followed, no crime has been committed. Morally questionable, a matter of perspective, legally actionable, not in the slightest. He tricked us, Robert roared, finding a reservoir of anger. He slammed his fist on the table, making the water glasses jump. He manipulated us. That has to count for something. A judge will see this for what it is, the vengeful, senile act of a bitter old man. Ah, the senile defense, I said, nodding slowly. I anticipated that. Arthur, the box, if you please. Arthur opened a drawer in his desk and produced a small, locked metal strongbox. He placed it on the table with a definitive thud. He then produced a key from his pocket, unlocked it, and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a digital voice recorder. What is that? Helen asked, her voice muffled by the table. Insurance, I said. Go on, Arthur. Play the highlight reel. Let's start with the day after my diagnosis. The library. Arthur pressed a button. The recorder emitted a soft click, and then the room was filled with the clear, unmistakable sound of Robert's voice. Can't just leave it to chance, Helen. We need to get Henderson to draw up a specific list. The company shares have to be handled first. I'm not having you and Mark trying to run things. You and Cynthia would run it into the ground within a year, trying to buy another vacation home in Aspen. Don't be dramatic. The point is, we need a plan. Dad's not thinking clearly. Hey, sentimental. I'll leave chunks of it to the museum or some nonsense. We have to protect our inheritance. Click. Arthur stopped the recording. Robert's face was a sickly shade of green. He remembered that conversation. They both did. Shall I continue? Arthur asked pleasantly. There's a particularly enlightening one from the funeral home. Something about the oppressive quality of the architecture of the house you grew up in, Helen, and a rather crude assessment from Thomas about the liquidity event my death represented. No one spoke. The evidence was irrefutable. I had not just observed, I had documented. I had weaponized their own words. You recorded us, Sarah whispered, aghast. In private. That's inadmissible. It's a violation. This isn't a court of law, Sarah, I said. It's the court of my opinion, and the verdict is in. You are all guilty of breathtaking avarice. The sentence is disinheritance. Now, for the last time, get out. This time, they moved. The fight had gone out of them, replaced by a numb, staggering horror. Robert turned without another word, his shoulders slumped, and walked stiffly toward the door. Cynthia shot me a look of pure, undiluted hatred before scurrying after him. Mark had to physically help Helen from her chair. Her legs seemed to have given way. She was weeping uncontrollably, great heaving sobs of loss, not for me, I knew, but for the money. Thomas and Sarah followed, their faces blank with shock, the reality of their newly ordinary lives beginning to dawn on them. Sarah, I noticed, was still clutching the keys to the BMW he'd bought her for her graduation. I wondered how long she'd get to keep it. The heavy oak door of the conference room clicked shut behind them. The silence they left in their wake was profound. Arthur let out a long, slow breath and leaned back in his chair. "Well, Elias," he said, pouring 2 fingers of bourbon from a decanter on a sideboard and sliding one across the table to me. That was arguably the most professionally satisfying moment of my 50-year career. I took the glass, the crystal cool in my hand. I felt a tremor run through me now that it was over, not of doubt, but of adrenaline. The culmination of months of planning. It went rather well, didn't it? The look on Robert's face, Arthur chuckled, shaking his head. Priceless. One wish I could have taken a photograph. It's going to be a masterpiece. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, sipping the good bourbon. The deed was done. The revenge was complete. And yet, a strange emptiness was beginning to creep in at the edges of the triumph. I had spent 6 months focused on this single, glorious moment. Now that it was past, what was left? What now, Elias? Arthur asked, as if reading my mind. Now, I said, finishing the drink and setting the glass down with a firm click. Now, I believe I have a funeral to unattend. I've been cooped up in that back room of Albright's 4 days. I need some air. I think you'll go for a drive. Arthur's eyes twinkled. Anywhere in particular? I think you'll go look at the barn, I said. The original one, where it all started. It felt like the only place left in the world that was real. I left through Arthur's private entrance, avoiding the main lobby, where I knew my family would likely be having a collective, shell-shocked breakdown. My car, a simple, reliable sedan I kept for errands and hadn't driven in months, was parked in a nearby garage. Getting behind the wheel felt strangely liberating. 4 months, I had been Elias Rice, the dying man. Then Elias Rice, the vengeful ghost. Now, I was just a man with a very large bank account and absolutely no idea what to do with the rest of his life. The drive out to the old property was a journey through my own history. I passed the fields I'd once ploughed, the diner where I'd wooed Clara, the town that had watched me rise from nothing. People in other cars drove past, oblivious to the man they'd just buried. It was a surreal, heady feeling. The barn was still there, though the land around it had been sold off years ago. It belonged to a young couple now, who used it for storage. They'd agreed to let me visit whenever I liked. It was weathered and grey, the red paint he'd put on it 60 years ago, just a faint memory on a few protected boards. I pushed the heavy door open, the familiar groan of the hinges a sound from my childhood. The smell hit me first, dry hay, old wood, engine oil, the scent of my youth. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light cutting through the cracks in the walls. It was empty now, save for a few old pieces of furniture covered in tarps, but I could still see it as it was. The 2 beat-up tractors we'd somehow gotten running, the workbench where my father had taught me the feel of a good wrench, the corner where I'd first kissed Clara, both of us smelling of grease and sweat. I had come here seeking solace, the comfort of a simpler time, but standing in the silence, the high of my revenge began to fade, leaving behind a colder, more complex residue. I had won. I had exposed them, humiliated them, and taken from them everything they valued. I had proven my point with the brutal efficiency of a corporate takeover. So why did I feel so hollow? A voice echoed in the memory of the barn. My father's voice, rough and kind. A man is judged by 2 things, Eli, the quality of his work, and the character of his children. By the first measure, I was a titan. By the second, I was an abject failure. The anger that had sustained me 4 months had been a fire, burning hot and bright, but it had burned up all the fuel. Now there were only ashes. I'd wanted to teach them a lesson, to shock them into realizing what they had become. But staring at the empty barn, a terrible thought occurred to me. What if the lesson didn't take? What if I hadn't shocked them into becoming better people, but had only hardened them into becoming worse? I hadn't just taken their money, I had publicly stripped them naked and revealed their greed for the whole world to see. That kind of humiliation didn't breed repentance. It bred a hatred that would fester for a lifetime. I had wanted to be free of them, and I was, but the freedom was lonelier than I had anticipated. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I half expected it to be Arthur, or perhaps one of them, calling to spew more venom. But it was an alert from my home security system. Motion detected at the main gate. I pulled out my phone and opened the live feed. It was a news van, then another, and another. A small crowd of reporters and camera operators were milling around my front gate. Somehow, the story had already leaked. Of course it had. A scandal this juicy couldn't be contained. The dead man walking. The billionaire's revenge. The headlines were already writing themselves. I felt a fresh wave of weariness. I couldn't go home. That house, which had felt so oppressive to Helen, now felt like a gilded cage to me. A museum to a life that was over. I got back in my car and just drove, aimlessly, 4 hours. I found myself on the interstate, heading away from the city, away from the town, away from everything that defined Elias Rice. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I hadn't felt so untethered since I was 20 years old, with nothing but a toolbox and a dream. As darkness fell, I pulled off the highway into the parking lot of a generic roadside motel. It was the kind of place I hadn't stayed in 50 years. The kind of place that didn't ask questions. I paid in cash, using a false name, a little trick Arthur had arranged as part of our discretion package. The room was clean but sparse. A bed, a desk, a television bolted to the wall. It was a room for a person passing through. A person with no history and no destination. For the first time since he'd walked into Arthur's conference room, I was truly alone. I turned on the television, and there I was. My face, my obituary photo, was splashed across the screen of a 24-hour news channel. The banner underneath screamed, "Lazarus billionaire, Elias Rice alive, disinherits family." They had the basic facts, sensationalized for maximum drama. They played clips of my family leaving Henderson's office, their faces blurred, but their distress obvious. They had Robert on camera, earlier in the day, before the reading, talking about how much he would miss his father's guidance. The contrast was devastating. They'd found photos of Sarah and Thomas at the country club wake, laughing. The narrative was being written in real time, and my family was being cast as the villains of the piece. The greedy, heartless children who got their comeuppance. I should have felt vindicated. The world was seeing them for what they were. But watching it, isolated in this anonymous room, it just felt sad. And cheap. This public spectacle was the final, messy consequence of my revenge. I had not only broken my family, I had hung their broken pieces out for the world to gawk at. I muted the TV. The silence of the motel room was absolute. No whispers of avaricious relatives. No hum of a well-appointed home. Just the low thrum of the highway and the frantic, unanswered questions in my own mind. What had I truly accomplished? I had protected my fortune from them, yes. But to what end? To fund a charity that would bear my name. Was that my legacy? A man so embittered by his own flesh and blood that he'd rather give his life's work to strangers than see a dime of it misspent by his family. I thought of Clara. What would she have thought of this? The woman who had loved those children with a ferocity that dwarfed my own. The woman who had believed in the essential goodness of people. She would have been horrified. She would have wept for them. And she would have been furious with me. This wasn't justice. It was a nuclear strike on my own bloodline. The door to the motel room felt flimsy. The lock seemed inadequate. For the first time in decades, I felt vulnerable. I had made powerful enemies today. Not business rivals, but something far more dangerous. People who felt they had nothing left to lose. Robert's rage, Helen's humiliation, Cynthia's hatred, they were volatile forces. I had proven I could outsmart them in a boardroom. But rage doesn't play by boardroom rules. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize. A local area code. I let it go to voicemail. A moment later, a text message popped up. "Mr. Rice, this is Deputy Miller, County Sheriff's Office. Need to speak with you regarding a complaint filed this evening. Please call me at your earliest convenience." So it began. They were fighting back. A complaint. For what? Emotional distress. Harassment. It didn't matter. It was the opening salvo in what I knew would be a long, ugly, and very public legal war. They would contest the will, drag my name through the mud, and sue Arthur for malpractice. They would use every trick, every loophole, every shred of sympathy they could muster. The loneliness in the motel room intensified, curdling into something darker. Isolation. I was utterly alone. My family was my adversary. My home was under siege by the media. My only friend was my lawyer, who was about to be embroiled in the fight of his career because of me. I had wanted to teach them a lesson, but as I sat on the edge of the stiff motel bed, staring at the muted image of my own face on the television screen, a terrifying question began to form in the hollow space where my triumph had been. What if the person who most needed to learn a lesson was me? The deputy's text message glowed on my phone screen, a tiny, official-looking dagger in the dim motel room. A complaint. It was so pedestrian, so pathetic. They weren't coming at me with a clever legal challenge to the new will. Arthur had made it bomb-proof. They were starting with nuisance tactics, harassment, emotional distress. They were trying to bog me down, to smear me, to make my life as miserable as I had made theirs. A cold, familiar anger began to thaw the hollow feeling in my chest. Good. Let them come. I had spent a lifetime winning. A fight was a language understood far better than introspection. One didn't call the deputy back. Let him wait. Let them all wait. Elias Rice didn't jump when summoned. Instead, I turned off the phone entirely. The silence in the room was now of my own choosing. I was a ghost again, but this time, I was a ghost with a purpose. The self-pitying thoughts about Clara and my legacy evaporated. This was war, and I was a seasoned general. Sleep was a fleeting visitor, chased away by plans and counterplans forming in the dark. By the time the first grey light of dawn bled through the cheap blinds, I had a new blueprint. Phase 1, revenge, was complete. Phase 2, fortification, was now beginning. My first call, from a payphone outside a Greasy Spoon diner a mile down the road, was to Arthur. Elias, he answered on the first ring, his voice tense. I've been calling you. The media is a circus. Roberts hired Bronson and Cray. I felt a grim smile touch my lips. Bronson and Cray were the most vicious, ambulance-chasing litigators in the state. They specialized in dragging things through the mud. Perfect. It confirmed their strategy. They weren't fighting the will, they were fighting me. Let them, I said, my voice calm. Arthur, I need you to do 2 things for me. First, freeze every account, every asset, every line of credit attached to them that I was personally guaranteeing. Their mortgages, their car loans, Sarah's boutique line of credit, Thomas' business loan, everything. I want it frozen by close of business today. There was a pause on the other end. I could almost hear Arthur's sharp intake of breath. It was a brutal, surgical strike. He'd been co-signing their lavish lives for years. Without my backing, the banks would call in the notes immediately. Elias, that's he trailed off, the lawyer in him assessing the fallout that will create absolute chaos for them. I'm counting on it, I said, watching a trucker wipe his mouth with a napkin inside the diner. Second, I need a new identity. Full set, driver's license, passport, social security number, the works, the best you can get, and I need a secure, untraceable phone. This time the pause was longer. Elias, that's highly irregular and illegal. So was there celebration at my wake? I replied, my voice flat. I'm not going into hiding, Arthur. I'm going on the offensive, but I need to be able to move without a pack of reporters and a process server glued to my back. Can you do it? He sighed. The sound of a man reluctantly stepping over a lion head spent a lifetime towing. It will take a few days, and it won't be cheap. I'm not worried about the cost, I said. Call me on this number when it's ready. I gave him the payphone's number. My next call was to a different kind of professional, a man named Sterling, who ran a private security firm that specialized in corporate counterintelligence. He'd used him years ago to root out an industrial spy at Rice Consolidated. He was ex-Special Forces, discreet, and terrifyingly efficient. Mr. Rice, he said, his voice a low, calm rumble. I saw the news. Congratulations on your recovery. I need a full workup, Sterling, I said, bypassing the pleasantries. My children, Robert and Helen Rice, their spouses, their children. I want to know everything. Financials, secrets, affairs, bad debts, parking tickets. I want every skeleton in every closet rattling so loud it keeps them up at night. Understood, Sterling said. No trace of judgment in his tone. He was a mercenary. I was paying for a service. Depth of investigation. Bottom of the ocean, I said. And I need a team on them. Discreet surveillance. I want to know who they're talking to. Especially if it's a reporter, or a lawyer named Bronson or Kratt. Consider it done. I hung up the payphone, the receiver slick in my hand. The actions felt good. Purposeful. This was the Elias Rice who had built an empire, not the sentimental old fool who'd almost given it away. The plan was simple. I would squeeze them from every direction. Financially, legally, psychologically. I would make their lives so untenable that contesting the will would become a luxury they couldn't afford. For the next 3 days, I lived like a fugitive in plain sight. I stayed in the motel, paying cash for each night. I ate at the diner, reading discarded newspapers that chronicled my own bizarre story. The narrative was firmly on my side. The recordings Arthur had leaked to a friendly reporter had sealed it. The public saw a heartless family getting their just desserts. I was a folk hero, a billionaire Robin Hood sticking it to the spoiled rich kids. It was on the third day, sitting in a cracked vinyl booth and shoveling eggs, that I saw the first crack in their foundation. A small article on page 6 of the business section. Rice consolidated shares dip amidst leadership uncertainty. The board was getting nervous. Robert had been acting CEO, but his authority was now a joke. The company he'd built was suffering because of my family's greed. The anger flared again, white hot. They were poisoning my life's work. That afternoon, Arthur called the payphone. The package is ready, and there have been developments. I met him in the parking lot of a sprawling, anonymous hardware store on the edge of the county. He got into my sedan, looking tired but alert. He handed me a thick envelope. John Croft, he said, pointing to the driver's license inside. Birth certificate, social security, passport. It's as good as it gets. The phone is in there. Clean, encrypted, prepaid, untraceable. Thank you, Arthur. Don't thank me yet, he said grimly. Bronson and Cray have filed a civil suit. They're alleging extreme and outrageous conduct, causing severe emotional distress. They're seeking damages. A lot of them. I laughed, a short, harsh bark. Let them seek. What else? Sterling's preliminary reports are coming in. It's enlightening. Arthur handed me a thin folder. Robert is in deep to a private gambling ring. 6 figures deep. The loans are unsavory. Helen has been having an affair with her tennis instructor for the last 2 years. Mark knows. Hay's been using it as leverage for a larger allowance. Cynthia has been embezzling from her own charity foundation. And Thomas' tech startup is a front. It's a Ponzi scheme. And it's about to collapse. I took the folder, my fingers trembling slightly, but not from regret, from a cold, purified fury. They were even worse than he'd imagined. They weren't just greedy, they were corrupt, rotten to the core. My own blood. Send the financial information to the relevant authorities, I said, my voice like steel. Anonymous tips. And send copies to Robert and Helen. Let them know the source. Let them know I know. Arthur looked at me, a flicker of concern in his eyes. Elias, this is getting nuclear. You're not just disinheriting them, you're destroying them. They did that to themselves, Arthur, I said, staring out at the rows of lumber and bags of concrete, and just turning on the lights so everyone can see the mess. I spent the next week as John Croft. I checked into a clean, mid-range business hotel in a city 2 hours away. I used the encrypted phone to coordinate with Arthur and Sterling. I was the puppet master, pulling strings from the shadows. The effects were immediate and devastating. I listened in via Sterling's surveillance as Robert received the anonymous package detailing his gambling debts. The panic in his voice was palpable. Then came the call from the bank, calling in his mortgage. I heard him beg, his voice cracking. The mighty Robert Rice, brought to his knees. I heard Helen's tearful, screaming fight with Mark when she realized I knew about her affair. Then the call from the IRS, informing her of a sudden audit of her personal accounts. Her carefully constructed world of elegant lies was crumbling. Sarah's boutique was closed by creditors within days of my freezing her line of credit. Thomas was served with papers from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Their lives were imploding in real time, and with every new disaster, a new, angrier, more desperate message was left on my old phone, which Arthur was monitoring. They were begging now. The anger had been replaced by sheer, animal panic. They promised anything. They apologized. They said they saw the error of their ways. It was music to my ears, but the symphony wasn't complete. There was one thing missing. I needed to see it. I needed to look into their eyes and see the full, total extent of their ruin. I needed it to be my final, personal victory lap. I chose the lake house. It was the one property I hadn't included in the Lazarus Trust. A small, sentimental oversight I'd made in my initial planning. It was the place we'd gone as a family when the children were young, before everything turned sour. It was empty, closed up for the winter. It was the perfect stage for the final act. Using a burner phone, I sent a single, identical text message to Robert, Helen, Cynthia, and Mark. No message to the grandchildren. They were just collateral damage in my eyes. The lake house. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Come alone. This is your only chance. I didn't sign it. They would know who it was from. The next morning, I arrived early. The air was cold and crisp off the water. The lake itself a sheet of steely grey. The house looked forlorn. Its windows shuttered. The dock pulled up onto the shore. I unlocked the door and went inside. The smell of mildew and closed-up spaces filled my nostrils. Dust sheets covered the furniture, like a field of ghosts. I positioned myself in the large living room, in a worn armchair that had been my favourite. I faced the door, and I waited. Robert was the first to arrive, his car screeching to a halt on the gravel driveway. He burst through the door alone, his face haggard, his eyes wild. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "Dad," he called out, his voice echoing in the empty house. "Where are you?" "What is this?" "In here, Robert," I said, my voice calm. He appeared in the doorway, breathing heavily. He saw me, and for a moment, pure, unadulterated hatred flashed across his face before it was swallowed by a desperate, cringing need. "Dad, you have to stop this," he pleaded, taking a step into the room. "My house, the bank, my creditors, they're destroying me." "You did that, Robert," I said quietly. "Not me. I just stopped writing the checks." Then Helen arrived, her face puffy from crying. She saw Robert and then me, and she let out a small, broken sound. "Papa, please," she sobbed, collapsing onto a dust-covered sofa. "The audit Mark left me, he took the silverware. For God's sake. Everyone knows about everything." Cynthia and Mark arrived together. Though they stood apart, their mutual loathing a palpable force in the room. Cynthia's designer clothes looked rumpled, her hair flat. Mark just looked scared. "You've ruined us," Cynthia spat at me, her voice trembling. "You've ruined everything." "You've ended your vacation," I corrected her. "The vacation I funded." They all started talking at once then, a cacophony of pleas, accusations, and sobs. They were like animals in a trap, gnawing off their own legs. They offered to drop the lawsuit. They promised to be better children. Robert swore he'd go to rehab. Helen swore she'd never see her tennis pro again. I let them talk. I let them debase themselves completely. I watched the last shreds of their dignity evaporate. This was it. This was the absolute peak of my vengeance. I had reduced them to this, begging, broken shells in a dusty, cold room. I held up my hand. The room fell silent. "I brought you here," I said, my voice echoing in the silence, "to this place, because this is where I thought I had a family. It was an illusion. You are not a family. You are a business partnership that failed." I stood up, walking slowly towards them. They shrank back. "The lawsuit," I continued. "You can proceed. It will cost you money you no longer have. Arthur will tie you up in court 4 years. The anonymous tips to the IRS, the SEC, the Gaming Commission, those are just the beginning. I have a lifetime of resources and a burning desire to see this through. You will spend the rest of your lives fighting legal battles and hiding from loan sharks. You will have nothing. You will be nothing. The finality in my voice extinguished the last flicker of hope in their eyes. They understood. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a sentencing. Now, I said, pointing to the door, get out of my house. They left like scolded dogs, shuffling out into the cold morning without another word. I watched them from the window as they got into their cars that would likely be repossessed within the week and drove away, their lives in ashes. I was alone again. The silence in the lake house was absolute. The dust mote settled. I had won. Totally. Completely. I had shattered them. I should have felt a surge of power, of satisfaction. But as I looked around the room, at the dust sheets covering the ghosts of happier times, the feeling that washed over me was not victory. It was ashes. I had done it. I had proven my point with brutal, exquisite finality, and the proof was a void, a hollow, aching silence that was louder than any of their pleas. I had spent a lifetime building something, and in a few short weeks, I had not only torn it down, I had salted the earth so nothing could ever grow there again. The revenge was perfect, and it tasted like dust.